The crystal chandeliers over the Whitmore dining room flickered softly, casting a golden sheen across the long mahogany table lined with wine glasses, porcelain plates, and people who had already decided what I was worth. Eleanor Whitmore, my mother-in-law, sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over her loyal subjects. Her diamonds caught the light every time she moved her hand, and she smiled the way people smile before they strike. "So, Grace," she began, voice smooth as the Sauvignon Blanc in her glass, "are you still teaching at that little college in Pacific City?" Her tone carried that delicate blend of politeness and poison that only women of her generation had perfected. I dabbed the corner of my mouth with my napkin and replied calmly, "Yes, Eleanor, I'm still teaching. In fact, I was promoted to full professor last semester." A flicker of annoyance passed over her face before she recovered with a laugh that could freeze a lake. "A professor, how wonderful. You must be so proud of yourself. Teaching is such a noble hobby." Around the table, polite chuckles rippled the kind that hurt more than open laughter. Harold Whitmore. My father-in-law swirled his wine and muttered to no one in particular, "She could have joined the bank if she wanted real work. But no lectures and chalkboards are safer, aren't they?" Their daughter Sophie, perfectly groomed, recently promoted director of investments at Whitmore Capital, tilted her head and smiled with the sweetness of venom. "I suppose someone has to explain to young people how money works, even if they'll never actually handle it. It's adorable, really." I felt the sting, but I didn't flinch. Ethan, my husband, sat beside me, silent, jaw tight. He always froze in these moments, trapped between loyalty to me and fear of his parents' disapproval. I reached under the table and placed my hand gently over his. "It's fine," I whispered. Eleanor leaned forward, pretending concern. "It must be exhausting, though, dear. All those papers, all that grading, and yet so little impact. Perhaps Harold could find you a small administrative role at the bank. Something simple, something that lets you feel part of the real economy." The table erupted in small, knowing laughter. My pulse quickened, but my face stayed serene. "Thank you, Eleanor, but I already have enough on my plate. My current project with the Treasury Department keeps me quite busy." The laughter paused for half a heartbeat. Sophie snorted delicately. "The Treasury. What are you doing teaching interns how to use spreadsheets?" "Something like that," I said softly. I raised my glass and smiled, the kind of smile that hides storms. "You'd be surprised how much you can learn from theory when it's applied correctly." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing something beneath my tone, but not enough to question it. The conversation shifted back to safer, shallow topics: new real estate acquisitions, investment portfolios, and upcoming charity gala. I let them talk, let them gloat, let them have their illusions for now. They didn't know that I had spent the past 6 months quietly dissecting every line of Whitmore Capital's financial statements. They didn't know I had found inconsistencies, false valuations, hidden derivative risks, and forged internal transfers approved by the very daughter now smiling across the table. They didn't know that the little teacher sitting among them was preparing a report that could topple their entire empire. As Eleanor's laughter rang through the dining room, I studied her face and wondered how she would look when she realized the truth. The woman who believed theory meant nothing was about to learn that numbers, when used correctly, could destroy everything built on arrogance. My silence was not weakness. It was the calm before a very precise storm. The rain began halfway home, a thin whisper against the windshield that grew heavier with every mile. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale against the leather. Neither of us spoke. The glow from the dashboard painted his face in cold blue light, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Finally, he exhaled. "I'm sorry, Grace. I should have said something." I watched raindrops race each other down the glass and answered quietly, "You've said that before." He winced. "I just didn't want to make things worse." "You can't make worse what's already broken," I said softly. The words weren't sharp, just tired the exhaustion of someone who had been holding the same silence for too long. He glanced at me, his expression a mix of guilt and helplessness. "They don't mean it, you know. They mean every word I cut in. They believe success is money status, power. To them, teaching is failure dressed as idealism." I turned toward the window again. Outside, the streets shimmered with reflections of traffic lights and water. It looked like the city itself was crying. "They'll never understand what you do," Ethan murmured. "You could be saving the whole system and they'd still call it theory." His voice broke a little. I reached out and touched his arm. "You don't need to defend me. I'm not angry at you." He nodded, but the silence that followed said everything we couldn't. I used to believe that love could bridge class ambition and pride. I had tried so hard to belong, to host their dinners, attend their charity galas, smile through their condescension. I had set aside my research when Harold had fallen ill, spent months managing his medical care while juggling my lectures, never complaining. They had forgotten all of it. Maybe they never saw it at all. The first time Eleanor had called me our scholar, I thought it was affection. I realize now it was mockery disguised as praise. Hope had kept me at that table tonight. Hope that maybe after all these years they would see me for who I was. But hope, I learned, is dangerous. It blinds you to truth. The truth was simple. They would never accept me as equal, not unless I played their game, and I refused. As we turned into our driveway, I caught my reflection in the car window. I looked calm, but behind my eyes was a quiet fire. I thought of the documents waiting on my laptop, the reports that could shatter their empire. Ethan shut off the engine. "You'll tell me if you're okay, right?" he asked, his voice fragile. I smiled faintly. "I'm fine." I lied. I stepped out into the rain, let it soak into my coat, and stood there for a moment under the gray sky. I had given so much of myself to this family time, patience, dignity, and in return, they gave me silence and shame. That night, as the rain washed the city clean, I realized something I had always known, but never admitted: some relationships can't be fixed. Some must be tested, and when the truth comes, it comes like a storm. The house was quiet when we returned. Ethan went straight to bed, exhausted from tension and guilt, while I lingered downstairs in my study. The rain outside had slowed to a steady rhythm, a metronome against the window pane. I turned on my desk lamp, its golden glow cutting through the darkness, and opened my laptop. My reflection hovered faintly on the black screen before it blinked to life. The secure login interface appeared: two-factor verification biometric scan. The header read: United States Department of the Treasury, Office of Financial Integrity. My heart steadied as I entered my credentials. The screen opened to a classified report titled Systemic Vulnerabilities in Private Banking Networks. At the top, Lead Investigator, Dr. Grace Whitmore. That title always caught me for a moment, not because of pride, but because no one, certainly not my husband's family, had any idea that the teacher they dismissed over dinner was quietly shaping federal banking policy. For 6 months, I had been leading a small covert task force under the Treasury Department, reviewing risk exposure in major private institutions. Whitmore Capital, my father-in-law's empire, had surfaced repeatedly in the flagged list. I leaned closer to the screen, scrolling through the latest analytics from the SEC. The numbers confirmed what my instincts already told me: massive over-leveraging, undisclosed offshore funds, and derivative exposure that could trigger a national crisis if left unchecked. It wasn't just negligence, it was deliberate concealment. I thought of Sophie's smug face tonight, her hollow laughter when she said, "It's cute that you teach money." Cute, I thought bitterly, how ignorance dresses itself as superiority. I began typing notes for Monday's committee session. Whitmore Capital, Phase 3, irregularities confirmed. Recommend immediate internal audit and freeze authority under Section 82. I stopped rereading the line. Once I hit submit, the wheels would start turning fast. The Treasury would act. Federal oversight would move in, and my husband's family, the same people who mocked me for not working in the real world, would face public scrutiny of the most devastating kind. My stomach tightened. This wasn't revenge, it was duty. But the line between the two blurred when personal betrayal intertwined with professional truth. I opened another file: emails between Sophie and her father, authorizing temporary reallocation of capital assets to cover quarterly losses. Illegal, reckless, and utterly arrogant. I added them to the evidence folder. My phone buzzed. A message from Alan Pierce, my counterpart in Washington. "Grace, excellent progress. Whitmore's exposure matches 2 other flagged banks. Need your updated projections by Monday. SEC coordinating for oversight." I typed back, acknowledged. Final report in progress. I hesitated, then added, And yes, they still think I'm only a teacher. His reply came a minute later. Keep it that way. Makes your job easier. I smiled faintly, shutting off the light. He was right. Being underestimated was my greatest armor. As I powered down, I glanced at the framed photograph on my bookshelf Ethan and me taken years ago when things were simpler, back when ambition hadn't become a wall between us. I touched the frame lightly. I still loved him. But love, I had learned, couldn't save people from their own blindness. Upstairs, the bedroom light flicked off. I listened to the sound of the rain fading, replaced by the low hum of the refrigerator and the beating of my own heart. I whispered to no one. They wanted reality over theory. They're about to get it. Saturday morning arrived gray and windless. The city was quiet, almost reverent, as if it sensed what I was about to uncover. I brewed a cup of black coffee and returned to my desk, diving back into the files. The numbers didn't lie. They never did. People did. I opened the Treasury data portal and began cross-referencing Whitmore Capital's public quarterly statements with their internal audit files leaked anonymously to our committee weeks ago. Within minutes, discrepancies began to glow on the screen like warning lights. Inflated asset valuations, synthetic derivatives masked as stable funds, the same signature on every authorization, Sophie Whitmore. My cursor hovered over her name. I remembered her smirk from last night, her careless remark about real banking. She had no idea that her own initials were scattered across a paper trail leading straight into criminal liability. I started documenting the irregularities line by line, every number, every date. I created a separate file titled Exhibit 7 False Liquidity Claims, Whitmore Capital. I added the coded correspondence between Harold and Sophie that Alan's cybersecurity team had decrypted. It was all their private communications discussing how to move funds between shell subsidiaries to disguise quarterly losses. The arrogance was astonishing. They thought they were untouchable, that their legacy and influence would shield them. At 10:17 a.m., a new email notification blinked from the SEC liaison, Elena Rodriguez. Dr. Whitmore, the derivative cluster you flagged matches with patterns from two 2018 fraud cases. Sending you secure access link. Prioritize the section on Northern Ridge Holdings appears to be under Whitmore umbrella. I clicked the link and froze. Northern Ridge Holdings. Sophie's biggest acquisition 2 years ago. She had boasted about it at every family event. A masterstroke, Harold had called it. Now I understood why. Northern Ridge wasn't an investment. It was a cover operation funneling overvalued real estate bonds through an off-the-books liquidity pool. The losses were catastrophic, and Whitmore Capital had been bleeding money in silence ever since. I leaned back, heart-pounding, staring at the sheer scale of the deception. This wasn't an error. It was a system built on deceit. And the people who had laughed at me for teaching theory had engineered one of the most reckless financial illusions I'd ever seen. I drafted my report summary carefully. Preliminary conclusion: systemic misrepresentation of risk exposure, derivative misclassification, concealed losses exceeding $9.3 billion. Responsible parties: Harold Whitmore. CEO: Sophie Whitmore. Director of Investments, sign-off by Eleanor Whitmore. Chair of Family Trust. My fingers trembled slightly as I typed their names. These weren't just subjects in a report, they were the family who sat across from me at dinner last night. I closed my eyes for a moment. The sound of the rain had stopped, replaced by the faint hum of the city outside. In another room, Ethan's quiet footsteps echoed. He thought I was just preparing lectures. The truth sat heavy on my chest. What I was about to release would devastate his family and him. My conscience whispered one last warning. Do you really want to be the reason they fall? But the answer was already carved into my resolve. I wasn't the reason. They were. I was simply the mirror showing them what they had become. I called Alan Pierce. He answered on the second ring. You're early, Grace. I've got everything I said. It's worse than we thought. Offshore accounts, falsified reports, derivatives hidden under community investment fronts. He exhaled sharply. Jesus, are you prepared for what happens when this goes public? I'm not sure anyone ever is, I said quietly. But the numbers don't care who they expose. I hung up and returned to the keyboard. I attached the encrypted files labeled each section and wrote a single line at the end. Integrity means doing what's right, even when it destroys comfort. I saved the file to the secure Treasury drive. Then I opened my personal notes, the ones no one else would ever read. They called me only a teacher. They were right in a way. I teach through consequences. My cursor blinked against the white screen like a pulse. Outside, the sky had lightened slightly, the clouds thinning over the skyline. Somewhere in that city, Eleanor was likely hosting another charity brunch, Harold reviewing reports, Sophie strategizing her next deal. None of them knew the storm already had a name, and it was mine. By Sunday afternoon, the report was ready. I had checked every formula, cross-referenced every figure, and written an executive summary so airtight it could stand before Congress. Yet, as I stared at the file waiting for final submission, doubt crept in. Once I pressed send, there would be no turning back. It wouldn't just be numbers anymore. It would be names, their names. The doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find Eleanor standing on the porch, dressed impeccably as always, pearls gleaming against her tailored cream coat. She carried a pastry box like a peace offering. "Grace, darling," she said, the word darling slicing through the air like glass I thought I'd drop by. "You sounded so tired the other night." I stepped aside. "Come in." She made her way to the kitchen, inspecting everything as though judging whether my life measured up to her standards. "I brought your favorite, lemon tarts from Bellerose." "Thank you," I said flatly. She set them on the counter. "You know Harold worries about you. You've been working so hard. We think perhaps you'd be happier if you joined the Whitmore Foundation. Something stable, something in administration. It might be nice to feel part of the family's legacy." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You mean under your supervision?" She laughed, brittle and elegant. "Don't be silly. You'd have autonomy within limits. I'd simply guide you." I met her gaze. "Eleanor, do you even hear yourself? Every time you speak, it's like you're assigning me a rank." Her smile faded. "Grace, I'm only trying to help. You don't understand how difficult it is to keep this family's reputation intact. You live in your lectures and reports. The real world, our world, requires compromise." "Compromise," I repeated quietly. "You mean hiding the truth to look respectable?" "Oh, don't exaggerate." She snapped, then softened her tone again. "Grace, you're part of us. Stop trying to prove something." I looked at her and saw not malice but entitlement so deep she couldn't even recognize it as cruelty. "I'm not trying to prove anything," I said calmly. "I'm doing my job, teaching, protecting people from the consequences of your greed." Her face stiffened. "What did you just say?" "You heard me." A long silence fell between us. Outside, a car passed its tires, hissing on wet pavement. Eleanor's chin lifted. "I don't know what you think you're implying, but remember where you came from. Ethan may tolerate your independence, but this family has limits." "So does mine," I replied. She grabbed her purse. "You'll regret speaking to me this way." "Maybe," I said, stepping closer, voice steady. "Or maybe you'll regret underestimating me." Her eyes widened just a fraction, then she turned sharply and walked out. I stood there, the scent of lemon and arrogance hanging in the air. My hands were trembling not from fear, but from the certainty that any illusion of peace was gone. I had hoped foolishly that reason or kindness could soften them, that maybe decency could coexist with power, but that hope had died at my kitchen counter. I walked back to my study, reopened the file, and hovered over the send button. For a moment, I saw Ethan's face, heard his laugh from years ago when we still believed love could hold everything together. Then I clicked submit. The confirmation window appeared. "Your report has been received by the United States Treasury." My heart pounded once, twice, then steadied. It was done. Sunday night carried that kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. The house was dark except for the warm light spilling from my study. My laptop screen glowed faintly, displaying the confirmation message from the Treasury's encrypted system report received, awaiting review. I stared at those words for a long time. Each letter felt like a weight sliding into place. I had done it. There was no undoing it now. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion tugging at my eyes. The rain had stopped. The night was unnaturally still, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock above my desk. 11:43 p.m. In less than 36 hours, my report would be presented to the Oversight Committee. In less than 48, the Whitmore name would dominate every financial headline in the country. Upstairs, I heard Ethan shift in bed. I hadn't told him what I'd done. I didn't know how. I had once believed marriage meant sharing everything, but tonight, silence was the only mercy I could offer him. I saved the encrypted files one more time, shut the laptop, and went to the window. Outside, the city lights stretched endlessly, a sea of gold and silver. Somewhere out there, Harold was probably still awake, reviewing numbers, believing he was in control. Somewhere, Eleanor was polishing the image she had spent decades building, and Sophie was likely asleep in her penthouse, dreaming of promotions and headlines. None of them had the faintest idea that the walls were already cracking. My phone vibrated. A secure message flashed across the screen. From Alan Pierce, Treasury. Grace Secretary Collins has approved your report for Monday's 900 a.m. session. Prepare for in-person briefing. Outstanding work. I typed back, acknowledged, will arrive early. Then I hesitated, fingers still hovering over the keys, and added, it's going to hurt people I love. Alan. The reply came almost immediately. Doing what's right often does. You warned them in silence. That's more mercy than most would give. I stared at that message for a while. Mercy. Such a fragile word. I made tea and carried the mug to the living room where photographs lined the mantel. One of them was from our wedding day. Ethan holding my hand. Sunlight falling over us, both of us laughing, believing that love alone could protect us from the world. Another photo showed Harold shaking Ethan's hand, proud, welcoming. Back then, I thought that handshake meant acceptance. Now I knew it was ownership. Midnight passed. My body felt numb, my thoughts sharper than ever. I returned to the study and printed the final executive summary, signing my name at the bottom, Dr. Grace Whitmore, lead investigator. The ink bled slightly into the paper. It was proof that the woman they called only a teacher had written the words that would dismantle their illusion. When I turned off the printer, the sudden silence pressed in around me. I sat for a long time, listening to my own breathing. There was no satisfaction, no triumph, only clarity. Justice is never as clean as people imagine. It's sharp, complicated, and sometimes cruel. I glanced at the clock again. 12:18 a.m. Upstairs, Ethan murmured my name in his sleep. I climbed the stairs, paused in the doorway, and watched him for a moment. His face looked younger when he slept untouched by the storm I had set in motion. I whispered, I'm sorry, even though he couldn't hear me. Then I turned off the light and stood by the window, watching the first hint of dawn paint the sky faint blue. The countdown had begun. In 30 hours, truth would arrive, cold, unflinching, and irreversible. Monday morning, Washington, D.C., 7:28 a.m. The air carried the metallic chill of early winter as I stepped out of the car and into the marble foyer of the Treasury Department. My heels echoed sharply against the floor, the sound measured, deliberate. The guard at the entrance greeted me by name. No questions, no hesitation. I was expected. I had been here dozens of times before, but today felt different. There was a hum in the air, a quiet electric anticipation. My report had moved faster than anyone expected. The secretary herself wanted it addressed immediately. Dr. Whitmore Alan Pierce called out as I entered the conference hall. He was already there, tie-loosened, coffee in hand, worry etched between his brows. You ready? As ready as I'll ever be, I said. My voice was steady, though my pulse thudded like distant thunder. The Oversight Committee and Federal Reserve reps are all set, he said, checking his watch. They're bringing in Whitmore Capital's leadership by 9. They don't know I'll be here, do they? Alan shook his head. Not yet. Secretary Collins thought it best to let the evidence speak before names are revealed. I nodded. Good. At 8:15, the committee filed in men and women whose signatures could move markets, whose words could sink empires. The atmosphere shifted from tense to brittle. Files were distributed. Screens flickered to life, displaying charts, timelines, and summaries from my report. The title glowed at the top of every slide: Whitmore Capital Holdings Concealed Derivative Exposure and Systemic Fraud. I opened the meeting with the practiced calm of someone who had spent years teaching. Good morning, everyone. Over the past 6 months, our investigation into regional financial vulnerabilities has revealed several institutions engaged in deceptive reporting practices. Whitmore Capital is one of them. A murmur rippled through the room. Their risk exposure, I continued, is over 40% higher than reported. They've used shell subsidiaries to mask liquidity gaps and transferred volatile assets into charitable funds to manipulate balance sheets. These actions not only violate federal law, but pose a direct threat to economic stability. Allen handed out sealed folders to each committee member. I watched as heads bowed, brows furrowed, pens began to scribble. At precisely 8:59 a.m., a knock sounded on the oak door. "They're here," Allen said quietly. The door swung open and 3 familiar figures stepped inside. Harold Whitmore, commanding as ever in a charcoal suit. Eleanor poised and immaculate in a white blazer, and Sophie, expression cool but guarded. Behind them trailed their legal team. The sight froze something in me, not from fear, but from recognition of how deeply arrogance can blind. Harold's gaze landed on me and faltered. "Grace." His voice cracked the polished silence. What on earth? I stood. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. Please take a seat." "This must be some mistake," Eleanor interjected quickly. "We were told this was a Treasury oversight meeting." "It is," I replied evenly. "I'm presiding." Sophie's smirk vanished. "You're what, chair of the Treasury's Financial Integrity Committee?" The words hung there like thunder before lightning. I turned toward the screen. "Let's begin." Slide after slide appeared graphs, email excerpts, wire transfers, coded correspondence. With every word, the color drained from their faces. Harold's lawyer tried to interject, but I silenced him with a raised hand. "You'll have your turn." When I displayed the forged signature authorizations, Sophie gasped audibly. Eleanor's composure cracked. She reached for Harold's arm, whispering something that sounded like, "This can't be real." "You falsified liquidity statements for 4 consecutive quarters," I said, voice low but sharp. "You shifted losses into offshore accounts, presented fraudulent securities as collateral, and misrepresented your derivative exposure by nearly $10 billion. "This is absurd," Harold barked, rising to his feet. "You're twisting numbers." "Numbers don't twist," I replied. "People do." Silence rippled across the room. Behind him, Eleanor's trembling hand covered her mouth. Sophie's eyes glistened, not with remorse, but with panic. "You can't destroy your own family," Harold said, his tone desperate now. I met his gaze. "You did that yourself. I'm just the one putting it on record." Secretary Collins's voice came through the speakerphone from D.C. headquarters, clear and unwavering. "Dr. Whitmore, your findings have been reviewed and corroborated. Effective immediately, Whitmore Capital will be placed under federal supervision pending investigation." The words hit like a gavel. Sophie's pen clattered to the table. Eleanor closed her eyes, whispering a prayer to no one. Harold slumped into his chair, shoulders folding inward under the weight of something heavier than disgraced truth. I continued. "The committee's recommendation includes suspension of trading, full audit, and restructuring of executive leadership. All relevant parties will be referred to the Justice Department." Allen leaned over and whispered, "It's done." I exhaled slowly, looking at the family who had called me only a teacher. Harold's lips moved soundlessly. Eleanor reached across the table, her hand trembling. "Grace," she whispered, "why didn't you warn us?" My throat tightened. "Would you have listened?" She didn't answer. Her silence said enough. The meeting ended with formalities, signatures, and security escorts. As they were let out, Harold didn't look back. Sophie walked rigidly, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the floor. Eleanor paused at the door, turned, and met my gaze. "You could have destroyed us quietly," she said softly. "You chose to do it publicly." I replied, "Public harm deserves public truth." When the door closed, the tension drained from the room, leaving behind an echoing stillness. Allen turned to me. "You all right?" I nodded, though my hands shook slightly. "I will be." As I gathered my notes, my phone buzzed, a text from Ethan. Mom called. What's going on? Dad left the bank in a panic. I typed back one line. Turn on CNBC. By Tuesday morning, the Whitmore name was everywhere. Cable networks replayed the Treasury press briefing on loop. Federal oversight seizes Whitmore Capital following allegations of systemic fraud. The scrolling banners read like obituaries for an empire that once believed itself untouchable. I watched the coverage from my office coffee, untouched the sound low but relentless. On one channel, analysts debated whether Whitmore Capital's fall would trigger a regional banking shock. On another, a panel praised the courageous Treasury investigator who had exposed the fraud. That phrase repeated again and again, Dr. Grace Whitmore, whistleblower and lead analyst. It didn't feel like praise. It felt like exposure. My inbox overflowed requests for interviews, academic panels, think tanks. I declined them all. This wasn't a victory parade. It was triage. The system would survive. The family might not. My phone buzzed. Ethan's name appeared. I hesitated, then answered. His voice was strained, distant. Grace, what did you do? My job, I said quietly. My father's at the bank right now. There are reporters outside. Sophie's been suspended. Mom hasn't left the house since last night. I closed my eyes, gripping the desk edge. I warned them in every way I could without breaking confidentiality. They think you did it to humiliate them. No, I said sharply. I did it to protect people who don't have their safety net. They built a system that was going to collapse. Someone had to stop it. The silence between us stretched thin. You could have told me, he said finally. I had to see your name on TV. If I told you, you'd have tried to stop me. His voice broke. And you were right. Then he hung up. I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, until the screen went dark. By noon, stock values had fallen 62%. The board of directors announced Harold's resignation pending investigation. Federal auditors raided the headquarters. Photographers crowded the steps of their estate, shouting questions. Eleanor was photographed leaving the house, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. I hadn't expected to feel relief, but I also hadn't expected this hollow ache in my chest. Justice was supposed to be clean like numbers. It wasn't. It was jagged leaving cuts in unexpected places. Alan called that afternoon. The committee wants to thank you personally. Secretary Collins said your precision prevented a systemic collapse. That's good, I said, though my voice felt far away. You okay? He asked gently. I stared at the muted TV screen. A reporter stood outside the Whitmore estate. The caption read, Family in crisis as empire falls. No, I said honestly. But I will be. That evening, as dusk fell over the city, I walked home instead of taking a cab. The wind bit at my cheeks, sharp and grounding. The streetlights flickered on one by one, each glow steady against the growing dark. I passed a bookstore window displaying business magazines, my face on one cover, Harold's on another, our names printed side by side like rivals in a battle neither of us had wanted, but both had chosen. When I reached home, the house was silent. Ethan wasn't there. On the kitchen table sat his wedding ring and a handwritten note. I need time to understand who we've become. I touched the paper, my throat tightening. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry. Not for the marriage, not even for the family that had mocked me, but for the simple loss of what could have been if truth hadn't been necessary. The next morning, I arrived at work before sunrise. A bouquet of lilies waited on my desk with a card, To Integrity and Courage, from the Treasury team. I read it once, then set it aside. I opened my laptop and began drafting the next phase of stabilization measures. The work had to go on. It always did. Outside, the first reporters were already gathering at the building entrance, calling my name, shouting questions. I didn't stop. I walked past them into the lobby, back, straight steps, steady. The teacher they'd mocked had given her final lesson. Now the world was paying attention. The days that followed blurred into a quiet storm of noise and consequence. Every morning, the headlines hit harder. Treasury confirms multi-billion-dollar fraud. Whitmore family under federal investigation. Professor turned regulator exposes national banking scandal. The first arrests came Wednesday night. Harold was taken in for questioning. Sophie surrendered her corporate devices to federal agents. Eleanor withdrew from every public board she once chaired. Their mansion, once the epicenter of privilege, now stood behind police tape and flashing cameras. I watched the coverage from my office, the screen casting cold light across my face. Alan walked in mid-afternoon, carrying a stack of documents. Audit teams confirmed your findings, he said. Derivative losses are worse than projected. Over $12 billion unaccounted for. He paused. Grace, you did the right thing. I nodded, but the words didn't comfort me. Justice had come, yes, but justice never arrives without collateral damage. Late that night, as I left the Treasury building, a woman was waiting by the gate. For a second, I didn't recognize her. Eleanor looked smaller somehow. Her impeccable posture bent beneath invisible weight. Her eyes were swollen, her voice thin. May we talk? She asked. I hesitated, then nodded. We walked to a nearby bench under the cold white glow of a street lamp. She clutched her coat tighter. They say Harold could face prison, she whispered. The investigation will determine that, I said quietly. He thought he was protecting the company. We all did. We told ourselves everyone bent the rules, that it was survival, not greed. Her voice cracked. You could have destroyed us in private. I looked at her not unkindly. You destroyed yourselves in public. I only made sure the truth wasn't buried with the evidence. Tears welled in her eyes. You don't understand, Grace. We were terrified of losing everything we built. You didn't lose it because of me, I said. You lost it because you built it on denial. She exhaled a trembling breath, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. This was my mother's, she said, placing it on the bench between us. I was cruel to you. I see that now. I'm not asking forgiveness, just understanding. I looked at the box but didn't open it. Understanding doesn't erase accountability. No, she said softly. But maybe it can start healing. I nodded once. Maybe. She stood slowly. Harold keeps asking why you didn't warn us sooner. I tell him you did, just not in words. I watched her walk away, her figure dissolving into the winter fog. When I got home, Ethan was there, sitting on the couch, pale and sleepless. His voice was hollow. Dad's been charged with securities fraud. Sophie's name is on every network. I know, I said. They keep asking where you got the data. The press wants to know if you targeted them. I targeted corruption, I replied. It just happened to have our name on it. He rubbed his face. I don't know how to reconcile the woman I married with the one who brought my family down. I sat beside him. You shouldn't have to. I didn't want to destroy them, Ethan. I wanted them to see reality before it destroyed everyone else. You think that's comfort? He asked bitterly. No, I said. It's truth. We sat in silence until dawn began to gray the windows. When he finally spoke, his tone was quieter. Mom told me you were right, that she sees now what you were trying to prevent. I turned toward him. Do you? He didn't answer. He just looked at me for a long time before whispering, maybe someday. When he left for work, the house felt larger and emptier than ever. I opened the velvet box Eleanor had left behind. Inside was a small pearl brooch shaped like a circle, unbroken, imperfect, luminous. I set it on my desk, unsure whether it was apology symbol or warning. Outside, snow began to fall gentle and soundless, covering the city like a clean slate. But beneath it, the cracks remained. Justice had been served. Healing, I realized, was something else entirely. The following week, Treasury concluded its intervention phase. The new management team assumed control of Whitmore Capital under federal supervision, while investigations widened into other banks linked to their fraudulent derivatives. I was summoned to Washington to deliver a final debrief to the secretary. When the session ended, she shook my hand firmly. You've done this country a great service, Dr. Whitmore. The board will recommend you for senior advisory. I thanked her, but my thoughts were miles away. Titles didn't matter. Integrity had cost me more than prestige could repay. I spent the flight home staring out the window at the clouds, their edges glowing like glass in sunlight, and wondered whether truth was ever worth the loneliness it left behind. When I arrived back in Pacific City, Eleanor was waiting in the faculty lobby at the university. Her face looked older, softer. She held a paper cup of coffee, the steam curling faintly between us. I read your statement, she said. You told the truth with grace. I studied her for a moment. You came all this way just to tell me that. I came to ask something harder. Her voice trembled. Can we start again? I know I can't undo the things I said the way I treated you, but I've started working with the Financial Literacy Coalition. I'm helping families understand sustainable investments. I thought maybe you could help me teach them. It took me a moment to process it. The woman who once ridiculed my career was now asking to collaborate. Eleanor, I said carefully, this isn't about clearing your name. It's about changing what you stand for. I know, she said quickly, and I'm ready for that. I just need to know if you can forgive me. Forgiveness. The word sat between us, fragile and heavy. I gestured toward the hallway outside my office where students were laughing, running to class, their futures still clean and possible. Forgiveness isn't a switch, I said finally. It's a process, and it requires proof, not promises. Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening. Then I'll prove it, however long it takes. I believed her, not completely, but enough to leave the door open. Start with the seminar next Thursday, I said. Guest lecturers can always use first-hand stories about accountability. Her lips curved into the faintest weary smile. I'll be there. That night, Ethan called. His voice was quieter, humbled. Mom told me about the coalition, he said. She also told me you invited her to speak. I did. She says you forgave her. I said I'd consider it, I corrected softly. Forgiveness isn't amnesia, it's boundaries. He was silent for a moment, then said, You were right, about everything. I was just too afraid to see it. I thought family meant protection even when they were wrong. It can mean that, I said gently, but sometimes protecting truth is protecting family. He exhaled shakily. I'm proud of you, Grace. I don't know how long it'll take for us to be okay again, but I want to try. Trying, I said, is a good place to start. We stayed on the line, saying nothing for a while, just breathing together. The distance between us wasn't gone, but it was smaller. The next day, I found the pearl brooch still sitting on my desk. I pinned it to my blazer before leaving for class. It caught the sunlight in the hallway mirror, glowing softly, a circle unbroken. When my students filed in, I noticed two new faces sitting quietly in the back, Eleanor and a young woman from her charity group. I smiled faintly and began the lecture. Today, I said, we'll talk about ethics in financial systems and what happens when integrity meets power. Eleanor watched intently, taking notes like any student. For the first time, she wasn't a matriarch or a critic. She was learning. As the lecture ended, I closed my notebook and looked out over the room. Theory can change lives, I said, but only when we have the courage to live it. Eleanor met my eyes, nodded, and whispered, Lesson received. For the first time in months, I believed she meant it. A year passed. Seasons shifted, and the noise that had once consumed the Whitmore name faded into distant headlines and archived news footage. The investigations concluded with heavy fines, restitution, and industry bans. Harold accepted a teaching role at a local business college, ethics, ironically, and Sophie began working with nonprofit credit unions under supervision. They were no longer titans of finance. They were people stripped of illusion, learning humility the hard way. As for me, life found a strange new rhythm. Half my week belonged to the Treasury, the other half to Riverside University, where I continued teaching economics. The students now introduced me with awe, whispering about the professor who saved the markets. I didn't correct them, though. Inside, I knew saving wasn't what I'd done. I'd simply refused to look away. That spring, the university hosted its first Ethics in Finance conference. I stood at the podium under warm lights, looking out at a packed auditorium. Among the attendees were journalists, students, regulators, and in the second row, Eleanor and Ethan. She had indeed kept her word. The Financial Literacy Coalition had grown into a national initiative, and she was now one of its most active contributors. She spoke at schools and community centers, telling stories about integrity and failure, about the price of pride. When the applause quieted, I began my keynote. A year ago, I said I learned that truth doesn't destroy people. It exposes what was already broken, but exposure is only the beginning. Redemption depends on what we choose to build afterward. I paused, glancing toward Eleanor. She smiled faintly, her hands folded in her lap, eyes wet with something between pride and remorse. After the event, she approached me as the crowd thinned. I wanted to show you something, she said, handing me a printed article. The headline read, Former banking matriarch launches program to teach teens about financial accountability. I looked up at her. You're doing real work now. She nodded. You taught me that protecting others begins with telling the truth, even when it hurts. I didn't teach you, I said quietly. You decided to learn. Ethan joined us, a hesitant but genuine smile on his face. Mom's been volunteering 3 nights a week. Dad says it's the happiest he's seen her in decades. And you, I asked softly. He met my eyes, still learning too. But if you're willing, I'd like to start over. I hesitated, then said, starting over doesn't mean forgetting. He nodded. No, it means doing better. That evening, we walked together through the campus garden, cherry blossoms falling like pink snow. The scent of rain hung in the air. For the first time in a long while, the silence between us felt peaceful instead of tense. When I returned home later, the answering machine blinked with messages. News outlets requesting interviews, research collaborations, invitations to keynote summits. I deleted most of them. Fame was the least interesting outcome of truth. The real work was quieter, slower, rooted in rebuilding trust. I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped out onto the balcony. From my apartment on the hill, the city stretched out like a sea of lights. Somewhere out there, I knew the Whitmores were living smaller, humbler lives, but lives with purpose now. Eleanor had once said that family reputation was everything. She understood now that legacy was built not on power, but on accountability. As the wind stirred, I touched the pearl brooch pinned to my blouse, a habit I had developed without realizing. It wasn't forgiveness I carried anymore. It was perspective. The circle wasn't perfect, but it endured. In my next lecture, I would tell my students that theory means nothing until tested by fire, that justice and mercy can coexist when guided by truth. I would tell them that hope, even when broken, can be rebuilt from the pieces. Because I had lived it. It was late autumn when I realized how far life had come full circle. The trees around Riverside University had turned copper and gold, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and rain. I was walking back to my office after an afternoon lecture when I heard laughter coming from the classroom across the hall. Eleanor was inside, guest lecturing to a group of undergraduates about lessons from corporate failure. She stood before the whiteboard, not as the grand matriarch I once knew, but as a woman unguarded, honest, her voice steady as she said, "The hardest part of losing everything is realizing you built it on sand." I leaned against the doorframe, quietly listening as she continued. My daughter-in-law taught me that integrity isn't a weapon, it's a mirror. Sometimes when the reflection terrifies you, it's because you've gone too long pretending you're not responsible for the cracks. The class was silent. When she finished, the students applauded and she smiled, small, genuine, transformed. Afterward, she joined me in the hallway. "I didn't expect you to come," she said softly. "I wanted to see how far you've come," I replied. Her eyes shimmered. "Grace, I know I can never erase what we did, but I hope I can honor what you stood for." "You already are," I said. "Teaching others not to repeat your mistakes is a form of atonement." She nodded slowly. "Harold's working with community banks now. No power, no headlines, just helping rebuild local loan programs. Sophie's finishing her certification to become a financial counselor. We meet every Sunday for dinner. You're always welcome if you ever feel ready." I hesitated. A year ago, those words would have felt like manipulation. Now they sounded like humility. "Maybe not yet," I said gently, "but maybe someday." That evening, I walked through the campus garden, the leaves crunching softly underfoot. The lamplight flickered against the stone walkway, and for the first time in months, I felt something unfamiliar: peace. Justice had done its work, and so had time. At home, I poured tea and sat by the window overlooking the city skyline. I thought of the path that had brought me here, the humiliations, the silence, the long nights of doubt. Every slight, every dismissal had carved something stronger in me. They had taught me that worth isn't granted by family or fortune. It's proven by conviction. The world still spun fast outside. Markets rose and fell, policies shifted, but inside that quiet apartment, everything was still. My phone buzzed a message from Ethan. "Dinner tomorrow. Just us. No cameras, no family, just a chance to breathe." I smiled faintly and typed back, "I'd like that." The next day, we met at a small seaside cafe we used to visit when we were newly married, before the world had taught us its cruel hierarchies. The ocean wind tangled my hair, and the sound of waves drowned out the city noise. Ethan looked older, but calmer. "You seem lighter," he said. "I'm learning to let go," I replied. He nodded. I read one of your op-eds in the journal. You wrote that accountability doesn't destroy families, it saves them. I think I finally understand that. I smiled softly. I hoped you would. We talked for hours about work, about life, about how love sometimes survives, not because it's easy, but because it learns to bend without breaking. When we parted, there were no promises, no grand declarations, just a mutual understanding that healing like truth takes time. That night, I returned home and began writing again. Not a report, not a case study, but a book. Lessons from the fall. It wasn't about vengeance or scandal. It was about how fragile power becomes when it forgets compassion. I wrote about the arrogance that blinds the silence that enables and the courage it takes to stand alone for what's right. I wrote about forgiveness, the kind that doesn't erase pain but transforms it into wisdom. As I typed, the city lights flickered below each one, a tiny heartbeat of resilience. I thought about my students, about the new generation learning that ethics isn't an elective, it's survival. I thought of Eleanor teaching humility, Harold living quietly, Sophie rebuilding, and I thought of Ethan somewhere out there rediscovering his own truth. The story that began with humiliation had ended in something richer understanding. They had once called me only a teacher. Now they understood what teaching truly meant. It wasn't about lectures or titles. It was about revealing the cost of forgetting integrity and the redemption that follows when you remember it again. As midnight approached, I stepped onto the balcony. The air was crisp, the stars distant but steady. I touched the pearl brooch pinned to my coat, its small circle gleaming softly in the dark. For a moment, I imagined Eleanor's voice from that first dinner sharp and cold, then replaced it with her newer one, steady and sincere. I whispered into the quiet lesson complete. Then I turned off the light and let the night hold the rest of the story, one not of revenge, but of redemption earned through truth, humility, and the quiet strength of a woman once dismissed as only a teacher.